In the village of Cherea, near Verona, in the year 1630, 522 out of 1,000 people died, not in a war, but in a famine, in a single year, from a single disease. And what happened in Cherea wasn't unusual, it was the rule. For a long time, historians treated the plagues of 17th century Europe as something like a great equalizer. The disease moved across the continent, struck different countries at different times, and over the long run, it was assumed the damage roughly evened out. But when the historian Guido Alfani assembled a new database of 17th century burials, he found something the old story couldn't explain. Italy lost between 30 and 43% of its population to plague that century. England, less than 10, Spain, 18, France, around 12. It's not an even distribution, it's a catastrophe. In one corner of Europe, and a manageable disaster everywhere. So the question Alfani sets out to answer is simple. Why was Italy hit so much harder than the rest of Europe? The intuitive answer is that Italian plagues were just deadlier, that the disease itself was somehow more lethal in the south, and there's something to that. Mortality rates in Italian cities during a single outbreak were genuinely terrifying. 3 to 400 deaths per thousand was normal, and some places hit 5 or 600. English outbreaks averaged closer to 100. Here's the catch. England had plague outbreaks far more often than Italy did. Across the whole century, those repeated English outbreaks should have added up, and yet they didn't. The cumulative damage in England was a fraction of what Italy suffered in just one or two waves. So if it isn't lethality and it isn't frequency, what is it? Alfani's answer is a concept he calls territorial pervasiveness. And once you see it, the whole picture changes. In Northern Europe, plague was overwhelmingly an urban disease. It struck London, Amsterdam, the big cities. It killed densely, but it largely left the countryside alone. In Italy, plague went everywhere cities, towns, villages, even small hamlets across the Po Plain. It saturated the land. The numbers are stark. In the English county of Devon, across a full century of plague, 43% of parishes were never seriously hit. In northern Italy, across the entire period 1600 to 1657, only 9% of communities escaped. Same disease, same century, wildly different geographies of infection. And that difference, not the death toll in any single city, but the total reach of the contagion, is what made Italy's experience uniquely catastrophic. There's something else worth saying here, because it preempts an obvious objection. You might assume Italy was hit so hard because its institutions failed, that the response was disorganized, the leadership weak, the medicine primitive. The opposite is true. Italian cities had the most sophisticated anti plague institutions in Europe. The first permanent health boards were established in Italian cities during the 15th century. Spain and France copied them within decades. England, by comparison, had no public precautions against plague at all until 1518. Even at the start of the 17th century, English authorities were still importing institutional models from Italy and the Mediterranean. So this isn't a story of governance failure, or backward medicine, or a careless response. It's a story of a disease that overwhelmed even the best response Europe could mount. The geography defeated the institutions. But why? Why does it matter whether plague reaches the countryside if you're measuring the impact on a city like Venice or Naples? Because this is how cities recovered from plague before the modern era. A city loses a third of its population, the countryside, which was largely spared, sends people in, within a generation the city is back. Sometimes it's even bigger. In Italy, that was impossible. The countryside had been hollowed out too. There was no demographic reserve. Venice, which lost 46,000 people in 1630, took 70 to 80 years to recover. Naples, struck in 1656, didn't reach its pre-plague population again until almost a century later. And while Italy was treading water demographically and economically, Northern Europe wasn't waiting. The wool industries of Lombardy collapsed and never returned to their old levels. In Como, annual production fell from 8 to 10,000 cloths to 400. In Cremona, the wool guild shrank from 187 members to 23. This is the heart of Alfani's argument. The decline of Italy in the 17th century wasn't caused by bad governance or by some failure of culture. It was caused, in significant part, by a disease that destroyed the demographic base required for recovery. At the exact moment, Northern Europe was accelerating into the Atlantic economy. When COVID 19 spread in 2020, a lot of writers reached for the plague as a comparison. But on the surface, the comparison fits. Both diseases reshaped economies, both exposed how unprepared societies were, both killed people we loved. But Alfani's framework points to something the comparison usually misses. COVID was global and fast. It moved through the air, that traveled through the integrated infrastructure of the modern world. Plague was slower, but in the 17th century Italy, it achieved something COVID largely didn't. It saturated every village it reached, the places modernity hadn't yet connected. The lesson is that when we ask what makes a pandemic historically consequential, we're often asking the wrong question. Lethality matters, but spread, total, geographic, unrelenting spread, is what determines whether a society can recover or whether it slips quietly into long decline. In 1630, in a village called Cherea, more than half the people died. They were not famous, they were not powerful. Most of their names are lost. But what happened in Cherea, and in a thousand other places like it, is part of the reason a region that had been at the center of Europe for 200 years would, within a generation, no longer be.